The morning everyone noticed. It was November 17th, a Tuesday, still dark, the kind of cold that comes in off the Allegheny River like it has an agenda. The camp where Ruthanne Delano had been living since August sat in a strip of cleared land between a concrete parking lot and a chain-link fence that belonged to nobody anybody could identify. That morning, 4:15, everything frost-covered, her neighbor Marcus crawled out of his tent, with his hands already going stiff before he got to the second zipper. He'd slept inside a sleeping bag rated to 30 degrees, inside a tent, and he was still cold enough to feel it in his back molars. That specific cold, the one that works its way into the bone and stays there, was something everyone in that camp knew by the time November got going. You don't sleep it off, you just wait for the sun to clear the building line. Marcus stood up, exhaled a cloud of breath into the dark, and looked over at Ruthanne's structure in the corner of the lot. She was already outside, sitting on an overturned milk crate, drinking from a metal thermos, bare hands wrapped around it, not gloved, not bundled, just sitting there, quiet in the dark like it was a Tuesday morning in September. He stared at her for a second, maybe two. "You're not cold." She looked up. "The floor's what gets you. Gotta deal with the floor first." He had no idea what she meant. Not yet. This is the story of what she built, how she built it, and this is the part most people miss. Why the thing she figured out in a parking lot behind an appliance store on Allegheny Avenue actually makes complete sense once you understand what polystyrene foam actually is. It's also the story of what it costs to survive in a way nobody accounts for. Ruthanne Delano was 54 years old when she lost her apartment. She'd lived in Pittsburgh her whole life. Born in Homewood, grew up in Penn Hills, had been renting a one-bedroom on Perrysville Avenue in the North Side for 7 years before everything fell apart. The apartment wasn't much. One window in the bedroom that overlooked someone else's back steps, a radiator that worked but made sounds like a small animal was trapped inside it. A bathroom the size of a generous closet. But it was hers. She paid her rent, kept her dishes clean, had a small lamp on the side table she bought at Goodwill in 2013 that she liked because the shade was the color of old honey. She'd been working in the linen department at a hospital for 11 years, washing surgical drapes, folding them a specific way, 8-hour shifts, a specific rotation of days. Not the job anybody puts on a dream board, but it paid consistently, enough for rent plus utilities plus a little toward a savings account she'd been building for 3 years, toward eventually maybe a different apartment, one with 2 windows. March of 2018, she went in for knee surgery, routine, arthroscopic, in and out. But there were complications, infection, a second procedure, 6 weeks out of commission. When she came back in May, the position had been filled. The hospital expressed regret. She applied for 17 other jobs over the following months, got 3 callbacks. Unemployment ran out in February of 2019. April, she was 3 months behind on rent. June, she was gone. I want to say something about this part of the story, because I think there's a version of it that sounds like a series of small, unfortunate events adding up to an outcome that was sort of inevitable, like a math problem with a predictable answer. And that framing is wrong in a way that matters. Losing housing doesn't feel like a math problem. It feels like, first, you're behind. Then you're asking people for things you've never had to ask for. Then you're somewhere you didn't expect to be, dealing with things you have no roadmap for, and every single system that's supposed to help has a waiting list or a requirement you don't meet or a form you need. 3 other forms to get. Ruthanne spent 2 months on a friend's couch, then 3 weeks in a shelter. The shelter had a rule about stays, 30 days, then a gap period. And when the gap period hit, there was nowhere to go. And then she was in the camp near the parking lot, in a tent she'd bought from a Facebook Marketplace listing for $15 from someone in Bellevue who was going car camping, and decided they didn't need it. The tent was fine for September. October got harder. By the first week of November, she was waking up at 3 in the morning, with her hips and lower back aching in a way she couldn't describe, except to say it felt like being cold from the inside out. The appliance store was called West Side Refrigeration and Appliance, and it sat on a commercial stretch about 6 blocks from the camp. She walked past it every morning on the way to the gas station, where a man named Dave, everyone called him Davy, let her use the bathroom without buying anything, as long as she wasn't there too long during the morning rush. This arrangement had taken 3 weeks to establish. Small purchases, quiet respect, no trouble. $1.19 coffee here, a bag of chips there. Davy understood the situation. He needed the other customers to feel comfortable, which is a very specific arithmetic nobody talks about when they talk about dignity and homelessness. She'd noticed the foam blocks in mid-October. They appeared on a Tuesday, stacked outside the back door of the store, next to the dumpster. White blocks, dense, in the irregular shapes that come from appliance packaging. When a new refrigerator ships, it travels nested inside shaped polystyrene. Pieces cut to cradle each corner, each compressor housing, each curved side panel. The customer pulls out the appliance, and what's left is this pile of interlocking white shapes that perfectly map the thing they were protecting, now useless. Westside was setting them out for foam recycling pickup, but nobody was coming. She found out later the recycling company had stopped taking expanded polystyrene months earlier. It's almost impossible to process economically, which is why most curbside programs won't touch it. The blocks were just sitting there. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Friday, the pile was bigger. They'd gotten another delivery. She stopped on her way back from Davies and looked at the pile for probably 30 seconds, long enough for the morning to get a little lighter, long enough to notice how big the blocks were, some of them 3 feet across, 8 or 9 inches thick, and how they were just sitting there absorbing nothing, doing nothing, waiting to be hauled to a landfill. She picked one up, lighter than she expected. Significantly lighter. She'd assumed something that size would have real weight to it. She'd been prepared to need both hands. She didn't. She lifted it with one hand, no effort. Tapped it against her palm. Dense. Almost no give. No sound. Just a soft resistance. Quiet in a way that felt strange for something so solid. She set it back down. Kept walking. But she was thinking. Here is what expanded polystyrene actually is, and why Ruthanne's instinct was better physics than it sounds. When you make EPS, that's the technical shorthand, expanded polystyrene, you start with tiny plastic beads, barely bigger than grains of sand. You expose them to steam. They puff up. Each bead expands many times its original size, and as they press together, they fuse into a solid block. What you end up with is a material that is, by volume, roughly 98% air. Not air moving through it, air trapped inside it. Millions of tiny sealed pockets, each one isolated from the next. Heat travels in 3 ways. Conduction, heat moves by touching through direct contact with a cold surface. Convection, heat gets carried away by moving air. Radiation, heat radiates outward as invisible waves. To stay warm, you need to interfere with all 3. And what foam does, without any engineering required on your part, is stop convection almost completely. The air pockets are so small that the air inside can't start circulating. It just sits there, still, holding whatever warmth you've put into the space. The heat goes in and stays in. There's nowhere for it to escape to. And the plastic structure itself conducts heat poorly, much more poorly than concrete, wood, even fiberglass batting. A 2-inch sheet of high-density foam board out-insulates an 8-inch solid concrete wall, not marginally, by a factor of several times over. Ruthanne did not know any of this. She had no technical training, no materials science background, nothing that would have told her these numbers. What she had was 2 months of waking up cold at 3 in the morning, and a brain that was paying very close attention to what was cold and what was warm, and why. She knew the blocks were thick. She knew they were dry. She knew they weighed almost nothing and she could carry them herself. And she knew, this is the thing I keep returning to, because it's so simple that it feels almost embarrassing how few people act on it, that if she put something thick and insulating between her body and the ground she was sleeping on, the ground couldn't pull the warmth out of her all night. Because that's what was making her cold. Not just the air. The ground. Most people, when they picture sleeping outside in winter, picture the air. Cold air coming in. Wind. Exposure. And those are real. But they're only half of it. When you lie down on a surface that's 30 degrees, That surface is conducting heat out of your body at a rate that a sleeping bag on top of you cannot compensate for. The bag insulates you from the air above. Nothing protects your back from the cold below. You've got 150 or 200 worth of sleeping bag, and you might as well be sleeping directly on the surface of whatever is underneath you, because that's exactly what's happening. Ruthanne had figured this out gradually, not from a book, from paying attention to where she was cold when she woke up: lower back, hips, the backs of her thighs, the points where her body pressed closest to the ground, the places where contact was most direct. She'd tried cardboard under the sleeping bag, multiple tarps, a pad she'd found at Goodwill for $3. The pad helped. But the pad was thin, and thin wasn't enough, and she lay awake at 3 in the morning cataloging this fact while her hips ached. She needed something thick, something that didn't pass cold through itself, something she could afford, which was nothing, which is a constraint that sharpens your attention in a very specific way. The foam blocks were the answer. She went back the next morning and started taking them. The first trip, she took 6, stacked 2 at a time, 3 trips before the store opened. She didn't ask anyone's permission. The blocks were outside next to the dumpster. 3 days passed the pickup that never came. But she moved quickly, not because she was stealing, because homeless people get accused of stealing things that are in the trash, and she didn't want the conversation. This is just true. It's unglamorous, and it's true. She laid the blocks flat across her sleeping area. 6 of them, side by side, gaps filled with cardboard. Set her pad on top, then the sleeping bag. That night, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. She slept until 5 in the morning without waking up once. Not once. She checked her phone. A podcast she'd been listening to had stopped at 9:48 p.m. She'd fallen asleep in the first 15 minutes and hadn't moved until just past 5. And when she woke up, her hips weren't aching. Her back wasn't stiff. She was cold in the normal sense. She could feel the air on her face. But her body itself felt rested in a way it hadn't been since August. She lay there looking at the ceiling of her tent, in the dark, and processed this. Then she thought, I need more blocks. She went back to Westside Refrigeration every Tuesday and Friday for the next 3 weeks. By mid-November, she had enough foam to raise walls. She hadn't originally planned walls. The floor had been the goal, and the floor had worked, clearly beyond expectation. But she'd started to understand that what she'd built could be a shell, not just a platform, a small enclosure. Small was important. She'd thought about this at some length, lying awake in the new, better warmth of her foam-floored tent. You can heat a small space with your body alone. A human body generates roughly the same heat as a 100-watt incandescent bulb, all night long, continuous, whether you're moving or not. In a tent, that heat rises, hits the tent ceiling, and leaks out. But in a small, insulated enclosure, tight enough that there's not much air to warm, sealed enough that the warm air can't escape, that same body heat starts to accumulate. She drew it out in a small notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. A rectangle, 4 feet wide, 6.5 feet long, just enough for her body plus her bag, 3.5 feet high, low enough that she couldn't sit fully upright, but low enough that the interior volume stayed small. She was making a decision that comfort was less important than warmth, and that the warmth would come from the geometry. She scored the foam with a steak knife she'd kept from a food service donation. Scored and snapped, foam cuts clean along a scored line, like cardboard but cleaner. The corners she notched, so the blocks interlocked at a right angle rather than just butting together. Where pieces didn't match up perfectly, she packed the gaps with cardboard strips. She started on a Thursday, worked 3 or 4 hours at a time, stopping when other things needed doing: the library, the food bank on Wednesdays, the social services office that kept almost but not quite having a housing placement for her. The build took 5 days of working sessions spread across 2 weeks. She didn't rush it. She was building something that needed to work in January, and January in Pittsburgh is a different thing from November in Pittsburgh. The outer surface she wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, the transparent kind, thick, the construction site variety, a length of which she'd found rolled up behind a renovation on Perrysville in early November. She'd been holding on to it since then, knowing it would be useful, not yet knowing how. It covered the whole structure, 4 walls and roof, and she taped every seam with a roll of wide silver tape she'd found most of a roll of in the bottom of a donation bag. The tape was meant for HVAC ductwork. It's stronger and more adhesive than standard tape, doesn't release when wet, and she'd known that was the right kind of tape when she found it, though she couldn't have told you exactly why. Inside, she lined the walls and ceiling with something she'd also been holding, a thermal emergency blanket, the thin, crinkly silver kind, the one that looks like cooking foil and weighs almost nothing. She'd found it in October in a donation bag from a church group and had been carrying it for a month, not entirely sure what to do with it. She borrowed a staple gun from a man named Terrence 2/10 over and stapled the mylar directly to the foam. Walls, ceiling, right up to the edge of the door opening. The mylar reflects radiant heat. When your body radiates warmth, instead of the warmth being absorbed by the wall, the mylar bounces it back at you. It's the same principle as a space blanket around a marathon runner. Hold the heat close. The door was a piece of heavy canvas cut from an old moving blanket, hung to pull across from inside. There was a gap at the bottom. She stuffed it with a rolled-up towel, a solution so obvious that it's almost embarrassing, except it worked. She slept in the completed shelter for the first time on November 15th. Outside, 31 degrees. She crawled in at 9:30, pulled the canvas closed, zipped her sleeping bag, and lay on her back in the dark. It was the only sleeping position that really worked. The ceiling was too low to sit up in, but she'd accepted that trade before she started cutting. The mylar crinkled every time she shifted, louder than she'd expected. She lay still and listened to the camp sounds. A dog somewhere, a highway, the particular sound of 20 people settling in for the night, getting quiet, one by one. She fell asleep before 10. She woke up at 5 in the morning and the inside of the shelter was warm. Not room temperature warm. Not the warmth of a building with a heating system, but warm the way the air under a blanket gets warm after you've been still long enough. Warm from containment, from the patient accumulation of a body's constant slow heat output in a small space with nowhere for that heat to go. She'd stuck a cheap aquarium thermometer to the inside of the foam wall, the kind with a suction cup from the dollar store, and she angled her phone flashlight at it. 63 degrees, inside, when it was 31 outside. 32 degrees warmer. From her body, from foam that had been sitting in a pile behind a store, waiting to go to a landfill. She lay there looking at the thermometer for a while, in the quiet, in the dark that was starting to get lighter at the edges. Then she said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Yeah, okay," Marcus noticed. 2 mornings later, he's the one from the opening of this story, the one who found her sitting outside with bare hands on a morning that was almost below freezing. He'd asked how she wasn't cold, and she'd told him, the floor. Start with the floor. He looked at her structure, the plastic-wrapped white foam blocks in the corner of the lot, about the size of a narrow parking space, and said it looked like a freezer. She said, sort of, except backward. He slept in it one night when she was trying to get into a shelter. She didn't get in, came back at midnight. He was still asleep. She found a spot in the narrow space outside her shelter entrance and slept there for a few hours. Marcus, when he woke up, told her it was the best sleep he'd had in months. He said this quietly, a little surprised at himself, like he hadn't expected to admit it. Terrence, the man who'd lent her the staple gun, who'd watched her carry foam blocks back to camp for 3 weeks and said they were just packaging trash, asked for her advice the following week. His back was giving him trouble. She told him the same thing she'd told Marcus. Thickest material goes under your body, not over it. The insulation on top of you is the last thing that matters. The insulation under you is the first. He found some foam board, the rigid kind. The pink or blue sheets they use in construction insulation, not the white block type, but the same principle, behind a job site on Western Avenue, and brought it back and built up his floor, 2 inches, and then 3. He told her later it made the kind of difference he would have bet serious money wasn't possible. Word traveled. It always does. Camps are small communities, and small communities talk, especially when the topic is not being cold. By the end of November, 6 people in the camp of 20 had modified their setups. One woman, a younger woman, mid-20s, who'd been in the camp since summer and who'd been surviving on a sleeping bag and a tarp, lined the inside of her tent with the mylar blanket Ruthanne showed her how to attach. A few others built up their floors with cardboard layered deep and tight. There was a shift, gradual, not dramatic, but it was real. Cold started to feel less like something that happened to you and more like something that could be thought about, managed, partially negotiated. That's a small thing. It's also, when you're sleeping outside in Pittsburgh in November, not small at all. January came in hard. The first full week of January 2020, the overnight lows in Pittsburgh hit single digits. January 7th was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that stops being abstract and starts being a news event. The kind where people check on elderly neighbors, where pipes freeze, where the warnings go out. The kind that has a body count if you're not protected from it. In Ruthanne's corner of the camp, everyone who'd followed her lead slept through it. Not in comfort, not in warmth you described as someone who had a bed and a heater, but alive and physically intact, which when the temperature is 4 degrees and you are outside with no power and no heating system and no building around you, is the entire objective. That's the whole game. She'd made modifications by then, because she was always making modifications. In December, she'd found a second length of thick plastic at a demolition site and added an outer layer around the whole structure, with an inch of dead airspace between the two plastic skins, the same principle as a double-pane window. The gap itself insulates. Warm air on the inside, plastic layer, air gap, plastic layer, cold air on the outside. She'd also cut a small vent hole near the peak of the roof, no bigger than 2 fingers wide, with a loose piece of foam she could push open from inside. This was the thing that took the most thought, and she wasn't sure about it until she tried it. When you exhale all night in a sealed space, the moisture from your breath accumulates. Condensation forms on the walls. Wet walls mean wet insulation means reduced performance and a cold, damp night that's harder than a just cold night. The vent let the humid air out at the top. Warm, humid air rises, while the warmth stayed low where she was. It was a solution she arrived at through trial and error. First she noticed the condensation. Then she thought about why. Then she thought about what she could do about it that wouldn't let the cold back in. Then she tried the vent. It worked. These weren't accidents. Every modification was a decision, a small, specific, reasoned decision made by someone who had become, over the course of about 2 months, an expert in a very narrow field. How to keep a human body warm with the cheapest available materials in the worst available conditions. I want to stop for a second, because I think there's a version of this story that treats what Ruthanne did as a survival trick, something you'd find on a preparedness blog between tips about fire starting and water purification, filed under clever homeless hacks. And I want to be direct about why that framing is wrong. What Ruthanne did was engineering, observational, iterative, materials-constrained engineering. She identified a problem. She sourced available materials that nobody else wanted. She built and tested a solution. When it worked but had issues, she diagnosed the issues, reasoned through causes, and designed fixes. When her neighbors had questions, she articulated the principles clearly enough that other people could replicate her results with different materials and slightly different configurations. That is exactly how engineering works. The only difference between what she did and what gets taught in a materials science or construction engineering program is the institution. March 2020 changed everything, in the way March 2020 changed everything for everyone, everywhere, all at once. The pandemic hit Pittsburgh in the middle of the month. There was an order to clear encampments. The reasoning was sanitation and distancing, but then the city ran into the logical wall of telling people without homes to go home. And the order got suspended, or softened, or just quietly not enforced in that particular lot. Services got complicated. The social services office that had been slowly processing her case closed in-person operations. The library, which had been reliable warmth and Wi-Fi and a chair that wasn't the ground, went dark. But the camp stayed, and Ruthanne's shelter stood through winter and into a strange, suspended spring, the kind of spring where everything outside looked normal, and nothing was. In August of 2020, A housing placement came through. A subsidized room in Homewood, the neighborhood she'd grown up near. A room with a working radiator and a window and a shared bathroom. She took the room, she packed what she had, which fit into 2 bags in a box, and she left the shelter standing. Someone else moved into it almost immediately. She saw this as she was leaving and felt something she has described as complicated. Glad it would be used. A little strange to leave it. Not quite grief, but something in that direction. She doesn't know what happened to it after that. The camp was cleared in 2021. The structures were demolished. I've been telling this story as if what matters is the foam. It doesn't. Or it's not only the foam. The foam is the door in. What I actually want to talk about is something that I don't think we have very good language for. Something about the specific cost of ingenuity when you're in a situation that's supposed to make ingenuity impossible. Because here is something worth sitting with. Ruthanne was not supposed to be building anything. The official structure of her situation, the one designed by the system she was moving through, had a script. Show up to the office, fill out the form, wait for placement, check in weekly, be processed. That was the script. And she was following it. The offices, the lists, the forms, the weekly check-ins. She was doing everything she was supposed to do. And simultaneously, in her free time, with materials from a dumpster, she was solving an engineering problem that she then taught to her neighbors, who taught variations of it to each other, across a camp of 20 people, in the middle of a Pittsburgh winter. There's something that I find genuinely jarring about that picture, not because it's heroic, I don't think that's the right frame either, but because it completely contradicts the category that the systems around her had put her in. Problem. Caseload number. Bed needed. Person to be housed. Not person who builds things. Not person who figures things out. Not person whose knowledge is useful to other people. We have a very clean story about who builds things and who needs things built for them. And that story is wrong. Provably wrong. A man in Oakland during the pandemic built himself a foam shelter and called it his mansion on the block and said he'd rather stay in it than move into a city-provided structure. The word he used was mansion, which is funny and serious at the same time. A woman building an insulated shelter in Canada said it had the same insulative value a house would have, and she was warm in Canadian winters. A 64-year-old woman in Vallejo spent 2 years constructing a 2-room home on a vacant lot. Windows, blinds, a shower, a raised bed, and when the city gave her 72 hours to vacate, she filed a lawsuit and a federal judge issued a temporary order letting her stay. This is what people do, given a little time, given a reasonable expectation that what they've built won't be immediately destroyed. That last part is not a throwaway. I want to be honest about the other half of this story, because leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty. Most self-built structures at encampments get swept, bulldozed, bagged, disposed of, often with very short notice, often before the people who built them can salvage their belongings. The Highland Park home in LA that had stood for 5 years, wooden walls, a kitchen, a bathtub, decorated with the Dodgers flag, cleared by crews in a morning. The Koreatown camp with the garden, cleared. The one under the freeway, cleared. You could build the warmest shelter on the block and 20 minutes and a city contract and a bobcat are all it takes to erase it. Ruthanne's camp wasn't swept that winter. Others were. She got lucky, in that specific way. She got lucky in the way that surviving something you shouldn't have had to survive requires luck on top of everything else you brought to it. I keep coming back to one thing. That first morning she picked up the foam block, the one she set back down and kept walking. She'd looked at a pile of objects that a store was paying to have removed. Objects that were, by every official classification, waste, junk, things with no remaining utility. And she saw something. Not immediately. It wasn't a flash of inspiration. It was more like a recognition. The way you recognize someone you haven't seen in a long time. This thing, these properties, this material, and this problem, this cold, this body, this ground. She saw trapped air. She didn't have the vocabulary for it. She didn't know the science. But she understood. in the way that comes from paying close attention to what's cold and what's warm over several weeks of sleepless nights, that those blocks were holding something nobody else was using. Every one of those blocks, stacked behind the store, was full of warmth. Potential warmth. Warmth that had never been allowed into them. They were just packaging, never warm, but warmth that if you built the right structure around yourself, your own body would generate, and the blocks would refuse to let escape. She saw warmth that wasn't being used, and then she used it. The floor is the part I want you to actually remember. Not the mylar, not the double-layer plastic, not the vent hole. All of that is specific to her situation and her materials and her particular 42 square feet of a Pittsburgh parking lot. The floor, the ground, the thing underneath you. Cold moves up through ground contact faster than it moves through still air. A 30-degree ground surface is pulling the heat out of your body all night in a way you mostly don't notice until you can't feel your hips. And almost everything designed to keep people warm, sleeping bags, blankets, coats, insulates from the top, from the air above you, not from the surface below. Ruthanne figured this out by lying awake cold for 8 weeks and paying attention to where, exactly, on her body the cold was worst. Lower back, hips, the flat of her shoulders, the contact points. She wasn't reading a physics paper. She was paying attention. There's a version of intelligence that we only recognize when it shows up in the right context, with the right credentials, in the right building. And there's a version that shows up in a parking lot at 4 a.m. in November, wearing a coat that isn't quite warm enough, looking at a pile of foam blocks and seeing something that nobody around it was seeing. The second kind is, I'd argue, harder. It's certainly less recognized. Ruthanne is still in Pittsburgh, still in Homewood. The radiator in her room still makes sounds like a small creature is trapped in it, which she finds more charming than alarming at this point. She found part-time work in late 2021. Laundry services again. Different hospital, different terms. She checks in with the social services office occasionally, not as a client, but because she knows the staff, and they sometimes ask her advice about insulation and materials when they're dealing with people who are still outside. She doesn't describe what she did as anything special. She gets a little impatient when people do. What she did was think about cold and then do something about it. She had time. She had a specific problem. She had materials nobody else wanted. These are not exceptional circumstances, she'll tell you. These are just circumstances. But here's the thing. The foam blocks are still out there, right now behind every appliance store in every city you can think of, stacked outside by the dumpster, waiting for a collection that either comes or doesn't. Heavy enough to look solid, light enough to carry one-handed, full of tiny trapped pockets of air that go nowhere, do nothing, hold everything. The stores are paying to have them taken away. Nobody wants them. But warmth already lives inside them, waiting for someone to come along who understands that all you have to do, the whole trick, the whole thing, is get the cold to stop moving. Build it small, insulate the floor first, seal every gap. Let your body do the rest. That's it. That's all she did. And for one winter in Pittsburgh, on a cleared lot between a parking lot and a chain-link fence, it was warmer in her 4 foot by 6 foot by 3.5 foot shelter than anywhere else on the block.